Oh, okay. Yeah, we are live. Congrats to making it to the final, biochar events. You are all the hardcore biochar folks here, learning about insetting. Maybe just to get like a quick sense of how well we might know insetting. Not gonna call on any of you. Have you heard of insetting? Like, do you understand insetting? Okay. Few people, cool. Well, yeah, really excited to talk about how biochar can tap into insetting and how we can unlock financing for biochar projects that flow directly into global supply chains. I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Valorize Systems. We help biochar project developers get access to the market faster. We do project design documentation, LCAs, and we help agri-food businesses, integrate biochar projects into their supply chains. I'm joined by a bunch of smart folks over here. I'll let them introduce themselves. So yeah, maybe if you take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Tristan. Hi everyone. I'm Giorgio Ponte from ecoLocked. We are a German company. What we are doing, we are obviously working in insetting, and more specifically into biochar into concrete. So we have a proprietary process to transform raw biochar into a concrete admixture. We've been doing this for almost 4 years now. Most of our operations are based in Germany, but I'm personally based in the US now. And I want to talk to you about some of the challenges and successes that we've been having through this 4 years. We started in a small lab as a startup, and now we have our first operating plant just outside of Berlin. And yeah, looking forward to tell you more. But before...
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Hallowell. I'm with Biomass Controls. I'm based in Woodstock, Connecticut. And I've been in the biochar industry for about 16 years now. And started with woody biomass. And then in 2013, we started working with biosolids and manures. And since then, we pretty much don't do woody biomass. So we're primarily working with corporations on helping them achieve their Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions and reduce their carbon footprint so that they don't have to buy any more carbon credits.
Thank you, Tristan, and welcome everybody. My name is Mayo Ryan. I'm a co-founder and the CEO of the Sitos Group. We're a Central California-based biochar manufacturing and carbon removal company. I got into the biochar world. I drank the Kool-Aid in 2018 after reading this great book called Burn. Who knew? Shameless plug to Kathleen. Sitos is another name, if you're curious, for the Olympic goddess Demeter, who's the protector of the harvest and the protector of food and grain. So we named the company after her. Hopefully she's the protector of climate change now in biochar. We are really large wine grape growers who backward integrated into the biochar business. We've been using biochar in our wine grapes for about 10 years and more or less have perfected the use of biochar, mostly at planting, but now in a production setting as well. Biochar in wine grapes is an established thing. We've got some great people in Napa right back there smiling away, and we hope to take this knowledge into almonds, pistachios, other horticultural crops, row crops. We've got a long way to go, so you'll hear me talk a lot about growers today, but again, you're welcome. I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks. So maybe before diving into the panel, maybe just to level set on just a simple definition of what insetting is. So you're probably familiar with offsetting. Maybe when a company buys to neutralize their emissions, they pay for a carbon benefit somewhere else in the world. It's not connected to their value chain, it's not connected to their supply chain, but they get to claim that benefit. Insetting, on the other hand, is when a company avoids, reduces, or removes carbon within their value chain or supply chain. So here, as you can see, we're working with companies that are integrating biochar into concrete. They're turning diapers into biochar. They are applying biochar to wineries and to almond orchards to really tie in the value of that biochar carbon removal into the actual crop itself so that companies can start to be able to claim the benefits together as opposed to separately. So we're really excited about this market. It's something that we think is underserved and not talked about enough. So I guess with that, we are starting the talk to really talk about what are some of the economic and regulatory pushes for insetting? Why might a company pursue insetting over offsetting? So maybe Jeff, to start with you, I know you deal with a lot of Scope 1 emissions, a lot of converting some tricky materials into biochar. So maybe talk to me about why might a company use biomass controls and what are they looking for?
Okay, thanks, Tristan. So a lot of things have changed and are changing quickly. For most of our clients, they had a voluntary program of ways to have a sustainable end of life for their products, whether it was biosolids or whether it was textiles. They wanted to make sure that voluntarily their customers could find a sustainable end of life, because that's really the market that they were going after. What's happened in the last few years in Europe, and now I think Colorado was the first one to do extended producer responsibility for packaging. Packaging is probably the largest volume of material or potential for insetting that now under law, what used to be scope 3 is now scope 1. So they are now responsible for the end of life of their product. And what's happening is they're changing the design of the product so it can be more compostable. But what they're finding out is for compost, they really want food waste. And there's a lot of issues like PFAS. PFAS is becoming a big issue over the last probably 18 months and probably getting even more and more important as how do we get rid of these plastics that are in our waste, whether it's in manure, whether it's in biosolids has become a big problem, and even in the food waste as well. So we offer a great product that can go alongside a compost facility, a digester facility, and others that are providing a sustainable end of life, and where they might have already gotten some credits for methane offsets. Now they can use the heat for heating the digester or generating power, and so there's a lot of opportunity there as well. So I think those are some big changes that have happened and will continue, I think, to speed up as I think there's 6 more states that are going to be moving towards packaging as well. So think about that. If you're a producer of a product, you're going to be responsible for the end of life. And for some products, like Tristan mentioned, diapers, it costs more to dispose of them than it does to make them. And so it puts a burden on the taxpayers. And what EPR tries to do is it takes that burden, it puts it back on the producers, which really puts it back on the consumer. So if you're going to be responsible for the end of life of that product, and you're going to be paying for it rather than your neighbors. So it's a big economic change, and it's how cities and municipalities are going to get to their goals for 2030 or 2050.
Super interesting. I mean, one thing you said is that the price of getting rid of materials almost more than pyrolyzing it in general. That sounds like a pretty attractive scenario for biochar. Could you maybe bring a case study to life for us and talk through like a example of what kind of one of these projects might look like within one of your clients?
Sure. So one example would be a company that sells compostable diapers in Colorado. There used to be, I think, 17 facilities in the United States that would take compostable diapers. Now there's only 2 left. And primarily because they really want the food waste. They want things that will turn quickly and sell, and they don't really have the treatment to meet some of the EPA standards for the biosolids. And if there's pharmaceuticals, herbicides, pesticides in there, they don't really, in some plastics, they don't really want to deal with it. So in Colorado, to sell it there, if you mark it as compostable, you need to provide that end of life, or the Attorney General will sue you for mislabeling your product. You're selling it as compostable, but there's no way to make it compostable. So my customer hauls that out of state. It costs about $1,000 a ton for them to haul it out of state. Now, not all of their customers do it, but they offer it as a service, and some of them voluntarily pay. But what we're seeing in other areas is some of the times disposable diapers, for example, are being banned, like on islands and things like that, where there is a very large burden on the community to dispose of those. And of course, they create methane in the landfill. They leach out into the water in the aquifer, so there's an environmental impact there as well. So there are some feedstocks like that where to make a diaper costs a few cents, to dispose of it costs about 50 cents. And so that's going to get pushed back, and some people will use more cloth diapers, but it'll happen in a lot of other things. Well, there'll be returnable containers. In some places like Seattle, they have places that will do returnable cups, and they'll take them back and wash them. And they'll use the heat from another process to clean them. So there's a lot of places now where they're getting rid of things and trying to remove it and do more reuse as well. So I think you'll see that increasing over the next few years.
Got it. And Mayo, you're working with almond shells. Maybe you can touch on what some of the almond industry is dealing with some of their residues, shells and orchard recycling.
Yeah, we're in a really unique situation in California. We generate about 45 million tons of waste in California. We can't bury it and we can't burn it. We had a law passed last year called SB 1383 that prevents us from burying any organics in landfills anymore. And our California Air Resources Board a couple of years ago banned the burning of vineyard and orchard waste, which was the traditional way of getting rid of that waste. About 15 million of that 45 million pounds is ag byproduct waste, so almond shell, pistachio shell, wine grape must, and those kinds of things, all pomace. Another 15 million tons are human biosolids, and the balance, or the other way around, is forest waste. So I think in my lifetime, I'll never have to really leave the state of California. There's plenty of work to do there. The almond industry is interesting. I got my start in this business building an almond processing company starting in 2017, trying to find a home for almond shell. We generate about 1.5 million tons of almond shell in the state of California every year. And there's really no good use for it. It's dairy bedding and road base. Almond hull, on the other hand, is cow candy. It's a really great nutrient for dairies, and we can't compete with that price. But almond shell, it spontaneously combusts. It catches on fire. I've been in a couple of those. They're no fun. But it makes a very wonderful biochar feedstock. And so what I've been trying to do in agriculture is to create these closed-loop carbon cycles. And in the almond industry, it's a very nice place to be, to have a pyrolysis plant and an almond huller sheller. The huller sheller is absolutely necessary. We can't have a brown skin almond in a can of Blue Diamond Growers without having going through the sheller first. So it takes the hull off, takes the shell off, gets all the dirt and twigs and sticks and rocks out of that almond. It uses a tremendous amount of electricity. I'd love to see big, large-scale dryers at every almond huller sheller using our byproduct heat so that we can go from on-ground harvest to above-ground harvest in almonds. But then the shell is right there. So our first project is at a place called Treehouse California Almonds, which happens to be a fully integrated almond company. They have both the huller sheller, which is where we're building our biochar plant, hoping to break ground in the next 45 days, and use their shell to bake biochar, and then take that biochar back into, at first, our wine grape vineyards in the Salinas Valley, and then into almonds and pistachios in the San Joaquin Valley. And that way we create a closed carbon cycle that every group in that supply chain can hopefully take advantage of. We've got, I don't mean to drown on about this, but the farm economy in California is pretty tough these days. Walnut prices are probably below some growers' costs of production. We just are realizing going through almond harvest this year that the crop is way down. So for next year, when we have a short crop going into that season, maybe prices will be up again. And this is the worst wine grape year in California history. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how all of this will work so that we can create a stack of benefits for growers, even if it's a couple pennies a pound for perhaps this offset credit going from till to no-till, or planting a cover crop, or adopting some regenerative ag techniques on the offset side. That helps to create some insets that the grower might, and have that grower on the offset side sell them to that third-party buyer. They get to keep that income. We can't reward the grower with our removal income. That's ours. Additionality prevents us from really sharing that. But offsets and insets and that stack of benefits on each side of that equation might add a couple pennies a pound here and there. So if we can reduce hulling costs by removing some of that electricity through byproduct electricity, creating a price premium for perhaps our first carbon negative consumer packaged good product, which we started thinking about in wine, but now we're at almonds. It really does help the grower. We're not going to be able to meet our climate removal goals without, in at least the next 5 years, in my opinion, getting a lot of biochar in the ground. At this moment, it really begins and ends with farmers. We can't remove carbon unless we get biochar in the ground, and we've got to get a grower to be happy about doing this, and lower the price of biochar as much as we can and still maintain profitability and scalability in our business. Hopefully get some carbon removal credits that can help. Practice code 336 at USDA NRCS, on offset and inset credits that we might be able to work on. Any way we can create some stack of benefits that, even if it's a penny here or a penny there, or $20 here, $20 there per ton, will, we hope, go along to help. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but it's a
No.
great question.
Yeah, that's great. I think you touched on some good points there. It seems like the almond industry, for example, doesn't have a lot of great alternative end uses for their materials, and biochar is, screaming at them, waiting to to be a solution. And then there's this scenario you talked about of, instead of just quantifying the removals, there's a bunch of avoidance and reduction benefits there as well. They're reducing those residue emissions and other things that they're being pushed to reduce from their customers. Maybe jumping to concrete now, I'm curious, Giorgio, do you know of, I guess, any regulations or market pushes that are that maybe would help a concrete producer, want to use biochar or help them push them in that direction?
Yeah, certainly. So what we're seeing a lot in Europe, especially in the larger cities and in the central northern European states, are, for example, limits in the embodied carbon that you can have per cubic meter of concrete, right? So typically, if you want to build a new project or develop a new project within a city, you'll have to supply low carbon concrete, meaning thresholds that, as of now, are really hard to meet, that a lot of manufacturers find hard to meet, even by reducing the footprint of the Portland cement, meaning adding fly ash or other type of supplementary cementitious material. So in this context, biochar, of course, can be of help. There are, of course, regulatory challenge, which we will speak about later. But this is definitely one of the largest push. What we're seeing a lot, and again, sorry, I keep on bringing the example from Europe, but that's where, as of now, our operations are, is that a lot of construction companies are really desperate for decarbonization or better insetting solutions. Another thing that we're seeing is that certain tenders, especially when it comes to government public procurement, will be, or construction companies will be allowed to enter in these tenders only if their EPD, so Environmental Product Declaration, LCA essentially, will be within a certain amount of CO2 equivalent per cubic meter or per functional unit. And so they are also seeking to resort to biochar to essentially compensate within their value chain for the emissions caused mainly by cement. Other than that, and this is maybe not strictly regulatory, but we are still seeing a willingness to pay a premium for green products. Again, mostly in the wealthier areas, wealthier member states or regions within that member state. So, I mean, one great example where we actually released our first product was the pavement industry. So we do not produce the pavers ourselves, but we are cooperating with a Dutch manufacturer, which has identified, of course, as a segment of their customer base that it's willing to pay extra for a carbon neutral paver. Again, and I'm giving a bit of a spoiler here, but there are still some regulations that push against this, in the sense that we cannot call it a carbon neutral paver yet, but we'll get to that in a second. But there are definitely drives both from the public sector as well as from customers for carbon reduced or low net carbon footprint products.
Sure, cool. So as kind of the first topic, really, like, what are the market mechanisms, the regulatory drivers of helping Insetting get to market? Take a pause. This is a longer session. So are there any questions before we move on to some of the carbon accounting and how we're kind of claiming a lot of this stuff? Yeah, a couple questions.
I had a quick question for Sitos Group. You mentioned that additionality prevents you from sharing the revenue with the growers. I was curious if you could expand on that, because of course somebody has to claim the environmental attribute, but my understanding is that you can decide with the supplier of the feedstock if you want to share the revenue with them.
Yeah, the subtleties of that may be possible. I'd have Tristan answer that question, but no, we're, as the generator of the carbon removal credit, by sequestering that carbon, in our case, in a compost pile, and then delivering that to the vineyard or the orchard, it is ours. And we spent a lot of time thinking about this. When the carbon removal came along, it made it much more possible for us to build a business in biochar and carbon removal. Until that point, the cost of the equipment seems to be going up a little bit, but we're we're doing a better job making that equipment have much more capacity, so actually the cost per pound and ton are coming down. But we really need that carbon credit in our business to make it profitable and viable. We're financing our first project with just pretty much normal debt, which in the biochar world, in the carbon removal world, is a good thing. I'm kind of proud of where we are with our nonprofit conservation-based lender. It's a good spot. We need a decent pro forma, and the carbon removal is a big part of that. Now on the grower side and on the offset and inset side, I think especially on the inset side, that can be shared throughout the supply chain. And what we've been trying to do for a while now, I thought it might be through somebody like Nori or Indigo. Unfortunately, Nori is no longer in business. Indigo's lost about 2/3 of its workforce. We tried to get, over the last few years, a company that could come into California and help growers work their way through generating some amount of income for carbon removal credits. It may not have been our removal credits, to answer your question, but this idea that I was mentioning earlier about stacking, and it could be a complex stack of offset and inset credits, it was very difficult to think about. Tristan and Valorize Systems are our DMRV provider, and one of the reasons that we at Sitos were so happy to do business with Valorize is that their deep background in agriculture, that they'd already started thinking about how to get growers involved in this. And so it may not be from us on the carbon removal side with an ability to share those credits, but now through, there will be more Valorize systems out there. I think this is a really great way to go. But we will start to find ways to get growers those credits by hook or by crook. It's not going to be easy. It's been difficult, and growers don't have the time for this. I'm a farmer, and all the growers that I know are already pretty busy, just trying to make ends meet and keep their operations going. Nobody has time to figure out this very complex carbon world, and it's evolving. 2 years ago, I would have thought it was a very different economic world in terms of what we were trying to achieve, and in 2 years it's going to be different. Hopefully we can help companies in the DMRV space grow through this and help more. But I hope that's a long-winded answer to your question, but we are trying to get growers some amount of carbon credits. I think it's through largely inset and offset credits. I think about this in I saw this great graphic in, I think it was Successful Farming not too long ago, that offset credits, they think about this in terms of Russian nested dolls. And so on the offset side, you've got the grower, the buyer of the grower's crop, the food company, the retailer like Target or somebody. The grower on that side can switch to a regenerative ag, a diesel motor to an electric pump, and so create his own credits or her own credits, keep them. They can't be, once that grower sells it to a carbon removal buyer or a third party, they're retired, so that grower can never go back and do that. But on the inset side, and especially through what Tristan and his team are working on, you can share those carbon credits throughout the supply chain. I'm not sure if it's on a pro rata basis, but that's very intriguing to us. And we're at the beginning of this. We've got a long way to go, but to answer your question briefly, we're trying, we're working on it. It's a new space.
So in the ag space, I do marketing in the regenerative ag space, and so the biochar and the regen ag space has issues. And how are you doing outreach to the farmers, especially in California, because there are regen almond orchards now. So how are you outreaching to them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I used to do a lot of consulting for regenerative ag, and I've never seen a situation where a grower economically wasn't better off converting to regenerative ag practices. I'm a little confused about why the regenerative community seems to resist biochar, but we've faced that a little bit. Our logo is a regenerative future. I'm hoping that we can use our biochar to facilitate a transition into regenerative ag. We have, in our wine grape operation, we've really reduced the amount of phosphorus and potash by putting biochar in the ground. Our fertilizer costs are down. Our yields are up across the board 30% or more where we've used biochar, especially in a pre-plant setting where we got a lot of volume there, without any degradation of wine grape quality and no extra water used for that 30% yield increase. Yeah. So we see, to answer your question, every single benefit and no problems. Now, this is all depending a bit on soil type. We farm our wine grapes on relatively sandy, kind of cruddy soils. So we're not going to see the same sort of yield increase in a very heavy clay or loamy soil. But if you look at the meta-studies about biochar, I think the average yield increase is about 10% across the board. Kathleen, you might be able to chime in if that's not the right number. But there's no downside to this, especially in a regenerative setting. Mm-hmm. And if the grower's confused about climate, we have kind of in California, we've got sort of Mississippi in the middle and Massachusetts on the sides. And so sometimes it's not all about climate change or carbon removal. So we have to talk about economics. There's just the positive ROI for biochar and wine grapes is 2-3 years at the most. And after 8 years of our Oasis Vineyard trial, I think we're at $15,000 or $17,000 positive ROI per acre because of that biochar application. So I may be overly optimistic about this. I don't see any downside to the biochar, especially in a regenerative ag setting.
I don't either, but there's a disconnect.
Yeah, so in the wine grape world, Steve McIntyre was that guy. He ran until our largest shareholder took it over a year and a half ago. It's the largest wine grape management firm in the world. We are trying to do a 100-acre almond trial in West Fresno County with a group called Arataberry Ranches. They're the Steve McIntyre of almond and pistachios. So we are targeting growers that are the folks at the coffee shop that are listened to, right? I caught the fish this big. And to work it that way, we're trying to do the studies, we're trying to do the research. It's going to be a haul. I think a biochar-based liquid fertilizer or biochar-based fertilizers that can seamlessly be integrated into a traditional farming practice but have carbon now, are not so much carbon unfriendly, is a potential way to go. I think we can produce those economically now, so it's not a big financial transition for growers, but we've got our work cut out for us. The carbon offset and insect credits, code 336 at USDA. When we start to think about all these things together, I think it's going to be difficult, but that's how we're going to get there.
Yep.
I wish there were a silver spoon solution. I'm not sure that there is, other than biochar itself.
I know we're all dying to get into the carbon accounting piece of this, so maybe we can move on to that. I'll start with you, Jeff. How are your clients kind of dealing with claiming and carbon accounting, and how far along are they on this process of understanding insetting and removals?
So primarily, I switched from talking to farmers to talking to the chief sustainability officer and Fortune 500 customers, and they still, most of them, all of them do not know what biochar is. And so then about a year ago, I signed up for a class, or applied to take the chief sustainability officer class at MIT. Actually, one of my classmates is here, so one was here yesterday too, trying to learn what is the language that they speak so that I can communicate to them how it would be beneficial. And they do a lot of analysis. They use a lot of different tools. So instead of doing like an LCA, they'll do an LCIA, impact analysis. They want to know, what are the different options? What can you do? We can do nothing. We can compost. We can do a digester. We can do direct air capture. There's a lot of things that they do. And a lot of their tools have lots of data sets. Some of them over 20,000 different kind of industry accepted data sets. There's none in there for biochar. So they have a difficulty model. And for them, it's high risk. For them to recommend this to the CFO is very risky because they don't have really credible data in there. So we have to do a lot of research, we have to do a lot of referencing, and the sales cycle is really long. But what they typically start off with is a benefit cost analysis. They're not selling the carbon credit, so it has to pencil out by just what they're doing. There's no credits there. They're claiming those credits as like their marketing, or as part of, they might be part of the New York Stock Exchange Sustainability Index, and they're basically saying, we offset this and we took those credits. Once they publicly say that they've done that, those credits are used because they've used them to be sustainable. And they're hoping that their stock price will go up, that their customers will pay a little bit more for their product. And so they're looking at a number of different tools to be able to do that. And so the lack of data in the modeling tools and in the accounting world is very difficult. One example would be like the difference between like attributional versus consequential accounting. So let's say I go to a brewer and I said, you have all this grain waste, why don't you make biochar? They said that's a great idea. So they do an analysis, they do an LCA on what it would be, and it looks good. But then they do a consequential LCA, because now the farmer that used to get the grain no longer gets the grain. So what's the consequence for that? So they're looking at all these different scenarios, and they're doing all this different modeling to make sure what the impact is on their community and what the impact is on their customers. And so they're not really doing like an LCA. They're doing, like I said, an impact analysis. They're looking at all the different possibilities and different choices because they're looking for low risk. And they want biochar to be the low risk, but they need more data on the accounting side. So the carbon accounting side is what they're doing. So I usually work with their accounting firms on doing it. They don't have a registry. They're not going through a broker. I'm dealing with their accounting firms, trying to explain to them how they can account for it. And it's a long process, and anything we can do to speed that up would burst us into the Fortune 500, as well as any company who says they're sustainable. Because in some states like California, if you're sustainable, you have to prove it, and you have to file your accounting. And same thing if you're a global company and have anything in Europe, you have to do this accounting practice. You have to show what your footprint is. So we need to provide those tools to the CFO and the CSO to be able to get those insetting sales. And once we do, I think we'll clearly be a better choice than a lot of the other options. And that's why I know direct air capture, for example, gets really easily, because it's very easy to model. There's a lot of data out there on it. And that's where we really need to push to if we want to get that, the higher value dollars in the higher value system.
Yeah, one thing you said that pointed out, or that stuck out to me, was these companies that are not using typical carbon credit registries that we know of, that offset sellers do, that biochar product developers that are selling offsets use, like Puro or Isometric or Vera or any of these registries. They're claiming them internally with the tools that they know, greenhouse gas protocol, scope 1, using their existing accountants to do this. Those accountants, they don't know what biochar is. They're relying on databases like ecoInvent that don't even have any emission factors for biochar. So I think, Jeff, made a good point of they just don't have visibility into the impacts of biochar. And even if we were to get the impacts in there, the biochar is all different, as we know. So I think that's pretty interesting. Maybe to jump into the concrete side, how does this work? I know it's a slightly different setup with environmental product declarations. Maybe talk us through how you kind of combine the removals to the concrete or not. How does that all work?
Yeah, so to a large extent it's the same issue that Jeff just mentioned. So a lot of companies don't know how to book the C-sink potential or the C-sink value of the biochar. We also, according to the existing regulation, for every construction product you need to have a EPD, or it's recommended in Europe that you have an EPD, which is essentially a life cycle assessment covering different modules from A1 to A3, so from production, transport, and sourcing of raw materials to the end of life phasing. So depending then, you typically have to declare different modules, but what's important is that is essentially the sustainability ID of your construction product. And right now, you cannot use biochar or the negative biogenic carbon value that biochar has to balance, to offset the fossil carbon footprint of the particular product. So a lot of people are asking us, and they try to insert a negative value that we provide them from our LCA into their models, but either you brute force that, or there's no other way around. It's just doesn't exist in the ecoInvent database, for instance. So while a lot of them, because we spent a long time going again to long sales cycles, we spent a lot of time educating them. They see and they understand the value and the potential. They're still unable to demonstrate the sustainability of their product with our biochar in it. So where we're currently facing a lot of challenges is really in the EPD, and especially in the EPD standard 15804. I'm not sure what the US equivalent would be, but it might be even the same standard, where it says that basically any biogenic carbon needs to be considered as released at the end of life of a product, right? Which is, it was taught initially for for example, wood-based construction products, and they make sense, right? Like you would have, I don't know, a wood panel or whatever, and then it would go into the landfill after 50 years, and then that biogenic carbon would be released back into the atmosphere. Essentially, the standard applies exactly the same principle to biochar that is embedded in concrete, and it's not released, even in a worst-case scenario where that biochar gets broken into rubble and put in a landfill. So we are crushing a little bit against the EN standard, and we've been trying now for over a year to bring up this case, and we're making progress, but of course it's a long process. And until that point, the only resource that companies have is essentially like a book and claim mechanism. And there they would basically say, declare in their own ESG report at the end of the year that they've retired so many credits, which contributed against or offsetting a certain amount of their emissions. The problem then there, it's whether that's interesting to some companies or not. So larger construction companies are definitely interested in that. They will also be more regulated under the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Directive, Reporting Directive, sorry. Other companies, smaller SMEs, are not particularly interested in that, simply because they are not at the moment obliged to report their emissions when they fall under a certain amount of revenues, emissions, or employees.
Sure.
So where it gets interesting for them, it's really in having again, carbon negative EPD or a carbon negative ID to simplify it for their products, and that's where we're really fighting for.
Sounds like lack of guidance, lack of regulation are making it somewhat difficult. Maybe Mayo, to jump over to you. I know you started the Uncorked program. You're tying the benefits of the biochar to the fields that it's applied. Maybe talk a little bit about just briefly how that system works, and then maybe how that is driving market demand for biochar. I know we're all here trying to figure out how we can sell biochar, right? And Insetting provides a way to combine biochar and the removals together to bring demand there. So yeah, tell me how the Uncorked program is targeting.
My teammate Jessica Bronner came up with the Uncorked, right? The Pro Earth CORC, the carbon dioxide removal credit, and so we did a little play on words and wanted to create an uncorked carbon negative bottle of wine. The reason that it took a little bit of a backseat is that our first plant is at Treehouse California Almonds, and so we've kind of switched from a carbon negative bottle of wine to a carbon negative almond just because that's the space that we're in today. We had a couple ads in wine magazines, Wine Enthusiast, and we sell to 66 different wineries. I think probably 50 of them showed up in Monterey wanting to know how we could get a carbon negative bottle of wine on the shelf. My co-founder, Steve McIntyre, has McIntyre Family Wines, and what we imagine is a QR code on the back of that bottle that you can scan in the store and actually look at its carbon footprint all the way through. And understand what part of that. So, for example, we've spoken to Gallo. The Gallo glass plant is a big carbon emitter. They really know what they're doing and where their carbon is emitted. So we would love to do that. It's just not the priority. Almonds are it right now. What we're hoping to do, the consumer demand for a carbon negative consumer packaged good product is out there. So Whole Foods has been working on this for years. General Mills, General Foods, are spending millions and millions of dollars on regenerative agriculture and carbon negative food products. It's really tough to do it today. Kind Bar, Target, Treehouse, the last team that showed up from Danone had 10 people. I think 6 of them were from the sustainability team. So the consumer demand or the consumer pull for a carbon negative food product is there. It's just how do we get there? And so for me, that's adding to yield increase, adding to reduce fertilizer costs by giving a grower a price premium. Again, another one of those stacks to get growers a little bit more money to make biochar more palatable. I don't know if that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I'm curious because you said you want to, release a carbon negative wine, essentially. Is this allowed in the US? Like, can you do it under existing regulation?
I can maybe take that one, yeah. Right now, no, but I think what we found here is there's no really standard for insetting, where the greenhouse gas protocol is currently working on their guidance, but that's been for the last years. So we're kind of in a weird place, in a gray area, where some companies are wanting to to blend biochar into their products, but really they're not able to claim that publicly. So what they do is they kind of purchase the removals separately, and they can tie that to their Scope 3 emissions, so it's still Scope 3 reduction, it's just not at the product level. But I guess maybe to open it up, we're in our last 10 minutes here. Any questions on any of that carbon accounting or anything? Yeah.
Jeff, you said it would help if we had some tools for the accounting firms, I think it was. What kind of tools specifically were you talking about?
Well, there's a couple different things. If you look up the definition for Scope 1 emissions, it's focused mostly on energy, because that is a big burden for them for their footprint. So that's why they put solar panels on, they put wind, they get EV cars to reduce that. And so what they want to know is, what I've always done traditionally for years and years is KPIs. We have KPIs for the system. But in the sustainability world, they do figures of merit. So they want to know, how many kilowatts does it take to make 1 ton of biochar? How many kilowatts does it take to make 1 ton of CO2 removal? So I think when people put out that, hey, this is a 1 million BTU system, they're like, that's way too much energy. So they're looking at it as, how is that energy being used, and how much, are they using natural gas? Are they using electricity? How are they running the system? So their focus is on, what is the energy that it takes to do that? That's one area. The other one is durability. I've used actually Tristan's tools on his website to figure out for the different protocols, what is based on the H/C ratio and the carbon content, organic carbon content, what was the durability? How many tons of CO2 removal do I get for this ton of biochar? Well, that's on his website, but it's not in any of the accounting tools. So we need that to be proven and then put into these tools so that they can do it on their own. And so that would be anywhere from like Danone or even like Nestle, who we have as one of our clients. They don't have those tools that available. And they're not going to poke around to find it on Tristan's website and trust and bet their financials on it that they're going to get audited. So that's why the auditors call me and they go, can you show me how these numbers came up? And a lot of the LCAs that are being done in this community are coming off some paper, or they're making up a number. But there's no accounting best practices to do that. And so there is an organization called ISBB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. And there's other groups, like he mentioned EcoInvent. They say this is the correct data. We don't say, hey, this is the carbon removal. We have to have a third party that tells what it is, and it has to be in the accounting software. So this is the other side of kind of the regulatory, the broker methodology side. They still want the methodology, but they want to have it in the accounting software. So those are kind of two examples. And then also we could have like the BCA, the benefit cost analysis. FEMA, that's their standard. Most municipalities use that. If you go on the FEMA website, and I can give you the link, it'll give you the tool set, it'll give you the training, it'll show you how you do it. But for each case study that we do, we should do a BCA to show how it penciled out, and as Mayo mentioned, for additionality, show that it doesn't need carbon credits to be viable. And that's a really important thing, because if it does, then under additionality, you can't count it. And they might say, hey, it doesn't matter for our program, we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. We'll pay more money to remove it per ton, because that's our corporate goal, is we want to get to zero. And some want to get to zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, but their goal at that point is they're not going to buy any more credits. Microsoft, they're trying to get back to 1975. They're buying credits to get back to when they started. Once they achieve that, which one of their goals says 2031, 2050, they're not going to buy anymore, because they're going to have the solar panels, the wind, the EVs, everything, and they're not going to need them. So if you're thinking long-term in this industry, the long-term customer past 2030, which is only in 4 years, is going to be the insetting. That's why I'm really happy that Tristan put this panel together, because there needs to be more attention here, because that's a much bigger market than the ag side. One example I have is I worked with a dairy farmer in Vermont that was selling their milk to make ice cream for Ben & Jerry's that was being owned by Unilever. Well, Unilever's sustainability group was paying that farmer to make biochar, to offset methane at that time, because of their carbon credit world was very immature. But a lot of the farmer is really just the user in a lot of cases. It's going to be Danone, it's going to be Nestle, it's going to be other companies that are going to be paying for this. And that's a great way to try to move this forward, is like, hey, we did this thing here, let's find out who's upstream and downstream of this farm and get them to kick in. And that's really the blend that Mayo and Tristan are working on, which is really the win for us, because now the farmer's getting money not from the USDA, they're getting it from the companies that are actually benefiting from using that, and they want them to be more sustainable. They're looking for these case studies. So,
Yeah,
sorry for the long answer.
I think that's one of the major differences with insetting is the kind of clients that are buying these insets and offsets. You see tech companies, banks buying offsets. You see consumer brands, food companies buying these insets. That's not to be said that Microsoft could not get in the insetting game. One example Giorgio brought up is book and claim. Microsoft builds a bunch of data centers. Data centers use concrete. You can embed biochar in concrete, and they can claim that against their Scope 3 emissions. So it's a creative way to kind of use insetting market to build biochar demand and to still target these large-scale buyers.
Gentlemen, this has been a great talk. I came in here kind of understanding what insetting was at a high level, but this has been very, very helpful, so thank you all. Tristan, I think this question might be more for you, actually. And at lunch, you and I were talking about the lack of kind of like a standard that dictates this right now, and you guys mentioned that already. And I think like most companies, they don't want to be stuck with egg on their face, right, when they make announcements. So that's probably something that this whole insetting needs to get defined better, because greenhouse gas protocol, it kind of fits, but it doesn't, it's not a perfect fit. But what about the other part of that I think that they lack is, or I don't know if they lack, I'm kind of asking you this actually, is traceability or like tracking. Like, is there, on the offset world, there's registries that have become very, like the foundation of, monitoring to make sure things don't get double counted and stuff. But is there anything that's tracking on insetting yet?
Yeah, so if you thought offsets were the Wild West, it's even more so in the insetting world. But there is tracking, there is traceability. So if you think about a company that's buying coffee or cocoa, they know who their suppliers are, and those suppliers know who their farmers are. If they know their farmers are applying biochar, they know that that's the removals that they're able to claim. And then that goes into their supply chain, into their ERP tools, maybe it's SAP. So all that still flows through their internal systems. But you made a good point, like they don't want to get hit in the face with a greenwashing claim. So a lot of what's going on in the insetting market is green hushing. They're not claiming anything, but they may still be purchasing insets, they may still be claiming regenerative agriculture. So we kind of see this mechanism happening. And I also think like registries will start to adopt insetting strategies and ways to kind of tie in the removals and the reductions and the avoidances along with that commodity that they're trading, and that that commodity will just get traced down to the supply chain. So where typical MRV stops at the point of biochar application, you need that MRV to kind of stop all the way to where that product was used by a consumer in the insetting world.
Unlocking the biochar for new demands, how do you see at scale price outlook on biochar, and also think about the fixed carbon content on it, and in addition, how the complementary of additional premium price in terms of replacing fertilizers?
So the question was, what is like the general price of biochar in this market? And,
at scale, right?
Yeah, at scale, and how does that kind of coincide with the reduction in fertilizer?
In addition, because if you look at the fixed carbon content itself, you only have a look at the carbon credits, right? But the yield to convert the biomass feedstock on fixed carbon will impact your OPEX and by final margin as well. So how do you see this outlook?
I can take that. Yeah, in our talk this morning when we were talking about subject matter, we were going to talk about some of the issues that we have, and we never quite got there. One of them for me is price parity for biochar. There really isn't a market index for biochar. It's not random, but it's supply and demand oriented. At the moment, there really isn't much biochar in California to be had. But not long ago, there was so much biochar available that the price was zero. And so growers were paying essentially just the transportation cost. It's a big debate that we're having right now about what is a fair biochar price. I can tell you my business can't rely at the moment on just carbon removal sales. We do need a fair price for biochar in order to scale the business, and we're not going to meet the demand, especially in California. I think personally California will be the first compliance market in the United States for carbon removal. We tried to get a bill across the finish line last year, didn't quite happen, SB 285. We have 643 this year and SB 88, which is a biomass bill that is going to really use biochar to get rid of biomass. So in California, they are trying to create, at least at a policy level, a demand for this. But there really needs to be a price for biochar that is fair enough that we can scale our businesses, but also makes sense for growers. And that's why we're going to so much trouble with Tristan and the rest of these groups to try and find ways that allow growers to participate in the carbon market, get a price premium, lower their fertilizer costs, all the things that I keep saying before, keep moisture retention in the soil. It's just there's so many things that we can do, but I don't think as a biochar provider I can survive, at least in the moment, or for another set of plants that we hope to build at a zero biochar price. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Quick answer to that too is, I've seen biochar anywhere from $50 a ton up to $50,000 a ton. And so it really does depend on what you're doing with it. So if you're using it to make a pigment to replace carbon black, or if you're using it for a special filtration product for PFAS, you can get much more money, much more dollars for it. So I'm not going to say you get what you pay for, but you get what the biochar producer understands that it's best at doing. Because it is different. The feedstock is different. You can take the same feedstock, you can run it through different systems, and you will get a different product at the end, because time and temperature are going to vary. So that really can change it a lot too. The conditions that it's in, what you do afterwards and what you do before. There's some people that add a catalyst to increase cation exchange or electric conductivity. There's some people that do a acid wash at the end. So how you value it is really on who is your customer. If your customer is Mayo, $50 a pound would be great, or $50 a ton. But if you're trying to make a battery or superconductor, you will pay tens of thousands of dollars for the right product. So I think you just have to match it and really look at what the value is and really understand what your feedstock and what your biochar is, and understand what your equipment is doing. If you don't know it, then you can't give that spec to the biochar manufacturer, which we make systems, that they have to say, we want this color, or we want this porosity, or we want this electric conductivity. And you have to make sure that that vendor can provide that to you. Otherwise, you're guessing, and your project will fail, because you're trying to get buy a piece of equipment with a piece of feedstock to make something that you're just guessing. And in engineering, you're not supposed to guess. You're supposed to be going for perfection. So figure out what you're selling to, who your customer is, and let them tell you what they want, and then that will drive the price. But if you're just trying to make it, you're out in the middle of the woods with a pile of biochar, I think $50 a ton would be good.
Way better answer than mine.
Yeah.
I would just like to add to that, that it depends on what you're displacing. So
Exactly.
In concrete, you can displace Portland cement, you can displace sand. In drywall, you can displace calcium carbonate, and they don't want to pay much more than what they're currently paying for, unless you can provide proof of performance enhancements that they'll pay for. And that's where I think we're all doing ourselves a disservice, is just focusing on carbon sequestration, when really what we should be doing is, saying, hey, my biochar is going to provide X, Y, Z, whether it's in filtration and it's 50% more absorptive than the activated carbon you're using, or in asphalt, it's longer living and things like that. So there's
I
a
totally
lot.
agree with that. I mean, the focus right now is on ag because it's the big market, and we're looking at volume, and we've got to get volume in the ground in order to solve the carbon removal problems. But we are all working on USBI and USBC, all of the agencies, all of us in this world are working on building these higher value markets, supercapacitors, ultraconductors, graphenes, right? But that's a little bit further down the road. We all think about it.
Yeah, I was essentially going to say the same. So our experience is that it really depends what you're replacing in the mix. So for certain specific concrete applications, we figure we can replace more expensive material, and so there is it's appealing for the construction company because they can actually save some money, and so they're willing to pay a pretty fair price for the material, for the biochar. In other cases, if you're just replacing sand, it's a lost battle. You're competing with something that costs $5 to $10 a ton, and we will never get to that prices, in all honesty. So really the drive there for adoption comes from regulation, right? Comes from what I was telling before, being able to enter center tenders, being able to build in specific areas where if you don't have a low carbon footprint, you won't get your permit, and therefore you need to pay that additional price. But let's say parity in price with commodities like sand, cement, we're probably still a long way from that.
Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for this conversation. I think it's been very productive. I guess I have two questions, mainly for Tristan and Giorgio. So I understand that here in the US, similar to Europe, we cannot apply credits, insets, or offsets to the APDs, right? And then we have customers that they want the lower carbon footprint product, right? And so the questions are, for example, Microsoft, right? They are buying the CDRs. CDRs cannot go into the APDs. So they are purchasing those credits to reduce their greenhouse gas inventory emissions, correct? I guess nobody can offer green products at this point using any of these credits, because how do you prove, right, that those credits were applied to specific products? I guess I want a confirmation on that. That's what I think they're doing. I guess I just want to confirm that, because I haven't talked to them. The other question is, are you aware of any, panels or any comment periods of comments to any of these standards to change the regulation for PCRs and EPDs in the US, where everyone could provide these comments as an industry or, individual companies, because I think it's going to be needed. We have some institutions like SBTI, even the Greenhouse Gas Protocol now in the land guidance, they are talking about using CDRs, not for Scope 1 and Scope 2, but for difficult to abate emissions beyond Scope 1 and Scope 2 or 3. So I guess my two questions are, am I thinking right that these big companies are using these credits to reduce greenhouse gas inventory instead of applying it to products? The other question is, are there possibilities for us as companies and industries to provide comments on the PCRs and the regulations for the APDs?
Yeah, from what I understand, there's a limit to how much carbon removals you can claim against your Scope 3 inventory. And so Microsoft may be doing that to some extent, but there's definitely a limit there. And so they also wrote a paper about the book and claim market using environmental attribute certificates to essentially tie some of the materials they're purchasing with the removals or reductions that are happening with that material somewhere else in the world. So for example, this happens in sustainable aviation fuel. You have Delta that they want to buy sustainable aviation fuel credits, but they may not actually be using that fuel in their airplanes. It's in their value chain, but it's not in their supply chain. So that's where the book and claim market comes, and they can claim that against their Scope 3. So that does exist. And there's also avoidance credits or reduction credits that you can claim. So let's say you're converting cocoa pod husks into biochar. You can claim that the potential avoidance of that cocoa pod against your actual product carbon footprint, but you can't claim that removal at this time. However, with the GHG protocol, which is the main standard that all these corporates are using, that doesn't allow that. So I think that it will change, and I think maybe we will get to a point where we can apply those removals to the product carbon footprint, EPD, LCAs, you name it. But right now, they're sort of using it as a proxy and claiming it in just a separate line item from that EPD. But I think it's definitely evolving. And in terms of standards, right now, in the US specifically, not that I know of. I mean, we're building that right now, with the Uncorked program and trying to build these systems. But it's difficult for that company to kind of claim that externally and also claim it within the GHG protocol. But it's a program that they can run, and they can essentially explain it transparently about what's exactly happening there. Maybe if you want to add any color to there. But.
I'm not very familiar with the US landscape at this point. I know that, at least bringing my experience in Europe, we've been able to sit within these committees and asking for a change to the standard, which is in discussion. Typically, a lot of the efforts have been going through the European Biochar Initiative, so I would see it going the same way here in the US, and probably trying to get the support of the American Biochar Association. But I'm also happy to look into that together, as it's on our agenda to get a better understanding also for the US.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think I have a similar question. I've heard a couple of times statements like, you can't claim the product is carbon negative. So I'm wondering, like, is that the FTC that's saying that, or who's saying that?
Yeah, so the companies that report their emissions are usually using like the greenhouse gas protocol as their essential formula on how to claim these things. So they're not using like carbon credit standards or methodologies, and that standard and the SBTi removals guidance, which is another guidance that they're following, it essentially prohibits the use of removals within that product carbon footprint specifically. They can use it within their scope 3 inventory. So let's say they purchase 1,000 tons of material and they also purchase 1,000 tons of removals. They can essentially neutralize their scope 3 emissions at the inventory level, but not at the individual product level. And that's my understanding. Again, I think we think that's probably changing soon, but yeah.
Okay, got it. So to sort of like get into the weeds on this, I would go and check out the
product carbon footprint that
Yeah.
we can start with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we can work our way back to a negativity in terms of carbon. I did a study for an almond huller sheller years ago about what converting to business as usual practice would mean if we converted almond shell to biochar and got that biochar back into the field. And just for that one huller sheller, it was negative 34,000 tons per year in a delta between business as usual and the new footprint. And that's a big number, I mean, for a single almond huller sheller. And so when we start to add up those practices against the existing product carbon footprint and document that, I'm not sure quite how to get there yet either. I mean, we're trying. This is the whole point, is include, at least for now, everybody in the almond closed loop almond cycle that I'm doing business with to work at each one of our own pieces of the supply chain and get this into the software package and hope that at the end of the day we can provide a product that is a legitimately carbon negative product.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, looks like that's all the questions. We have just a few more minutes. Is there any, I guess, points that you guys want to talk about? Any, I guess, what would need to happen to really see Insetting, scale and be a real market driver? It's something we don't hear about much, and what would, I guess, change that?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I feel like I'm a bit monothematic, but there's another standard together with the CO2 accounting aspect, so with DPD or PCF or whatever that may be, which is ASTM or EN standards, right? So when you're looking particularly at concrete, you also have to comply with specific prescriptions dictated by the different standards that you have, depending on the concrete application recipe. And that, of course, it's particularly restrictive when it comes to structural concrete, for good reasons. I mean, they hold the roof on top of our heads. But biochar being a novel material, it's of course not on the list of prescripted ingredients for concrete. We managed to get the first certification in Europe, and we can use our material as a additive for concrete, but we're still limited in the amount, in the dosage, when it comes to structural applications. So this is also something to bear in mind as a obstacle barrier to really the widespread adoption into concrete. Of course, there is still a lot of potential applications. Think about pavers, plastering, everything that is basically non-structural. It's usually a bit easier to get into. But I think more than 80% of the market is structural concrete, right? So if you really want to fully tap into that value chain, then there is a lot of compliance needed when it comes to ASTM standards.
Got it. And any of you two have any comments there?
Yeah, so I think what would be helpful is when you're doing a life cycle impact assessment, there's something called a UPR, which is a unit process. And in those unit process of how you're making the biochar, we could define those figures of merit, and then we could have producers start collecting or putting that data together. Because if they really want to get into the Fortune 500 companies, we're going to start having to provide that information. And if we do it at least voluntarily now, we'll be ready when they start implementing it. But I think getting a committee together on insetting to start putting together those data sets and those tools, the FOMs and the unit process measures, would be very helpful, because it takes years to get it done. And if we're thinking ahead to 2030, we really need to have it done by 2029 so that customers can use it to plan and have it there. So I think that maturity needs to happen quick. Otherwise, other negative technologies will surpass us in value, because they have a good model that corporations can use with low risk to make decisions to get to their Scope 1 emission goals.
That's a good comment. For me, it's the difference between the physical market for biochar and the market for carbon removal credits, and what other income items there might be, renewable energy, or do we get a tip fee? There are really generally 4 areas of revenue for a company like ours. But that's a different market than the carbon removal market. And how do we align those? Not all biochars are created equal. So right now, those nuances are lost on a lot of people. We've got a lot of education to do. We've got a lot of regulatory work to do. We still have a long, long way to go. But we're here today. And instead of 75 people I heard at the last one of these 10 years ago, we've got 600 people here today. And these great gentlemen here all working together to try and make this work. With Tristan and Valorize and other firms like his, we are creating these systems. But again, it's just, keep it going. I'm sure in 2 years it's going to look different than it does today. It sure looks different today than it did 2 years ago. The things that I was worried about 3 years ago, which was like equipment, what kind of equipment do we use? 2 years ago was EPA and all the other solid waste incinerator rules we were facing. That's not a problem anymore, but there's still lots of problems left to go, and standards are one of them. I think Giorgio is exactly right, but hang in there with us. We're trying to get it done.
Awesome.
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
Sorry, don't mean to hog the thing, but I sit on the technical advisory committee for the International Platform on Insetting. And first of all, I would like to cede my seat to you, Tristan. So, but it would be great, Jeff, if you could write that up and we could get it in front of them, because they are trying to set some of these standards. And I just joined the committee so they would know what biochar is, but you guys obviously have a lot more experience than I do. So
Super helpful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good idea. I think there are working groups or committees that are talking about these challenges and trying to address them. So I'm excited about what the next couple of years look like. Anyways, thank you all. That was a super deep dive in the session. But yeah, thank our panelists here. Yeah, thank you all.